Friends, last week I was on vacation, and so while many of you were on Zoom attending our virtual fellowship hour, I went for a walk with my camera. My plan was to take photos of flowers using a macro lens and a polarizing filter and a wide open aperture. I took some photos like this for our online service 2 weeks ago, and I kind of liked how the photos turned out, so I thought I would walk out into the hills between Montclair and Piedmont and take pictures and celebrate my last day of vacation by not thinking about church. Instead, I spent the whole walk thinking about this sermon. You see, I knew that we would be talking about earth care in today's service for the Lord's Day and in the congregational meeting that's planned for Sunday at 11. And as I took photos of flowers, I realized that we humans certainly change the world we live in, and we do so in ways that are not always consistent. For example, sometimes we take native plants and use them in our landscaping. Here's a photo of some California poppies that I took. But then sometimes invasive species imported for landscaping go feral and grow wild. All this got me thinking, is it good or is it bad that humans have such an impact on the world? Of course, it may depend on who you ask. I doubt the roses much mind that humans brought them out of China and now have cultivated them all over the world. In fact, while people may like to think that it is we humans who use roses to beautify the places where we live, it's also possible that the roses are using us as a matter of evolution, taking advantage of our love for beautiful and sweet-smelling flowers to establish themselves as one of the world's most dominant flowering plants. Who knows? One thing I'm pretty sure I can say for certain is that it is impossible for humans not to leave a mark on the parts of the world we inhabit. In fact, our survival depends upon changing the landscape. Humans cannot eat or shelter ourselves without changing our environments. It has always been thus. I asked David to read a passage from the book of Deuteronomy that speaks of the Hebrew people as being poised to enter into the promised land, where they will inhabit homes they did not build, enjoy wine and olives from vineyards and orchards that they did not plant, and drink from wells that they did not dig. And insofar as we are the inheritors of the earth, the same is true for us. The earth we inhabit and changed by our habitation was inhabited and changed before we got here, and generations yet unborn will change the places we now live to suit their needs for survival and beauty. The places where I walked and took my photos last Sunday have felt the impact of Americans, and Mexicans, and Spanish settlers and colonists, and for thousands of years the Ohlone people lived lives that also had an impact upon these hills and the lowlands that surround them. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the folks who lived in California before the Europeans showed up, they had a profound impact on the land. I don't know about you, but I spent far too much of my life thinking that native Californians lived passively with little or no impact on the environment, such that when the Europeans showed up, they found a wild and pristine natural environment in California. And I think that misconception is rooted in the racist assumption that native Californians were either somehow incapable of achieving anything of lasting value, or just disinclined to do much more than hunting and gathering. Well, in fact, native Californians were active and impactful stewards of the land that we now call California. Some were nomadic and built trails that continue to be used as roads today. Others built villages and towns that are still inhabited as towns and cities today. Either way, the impact of the native people on the land was significant, and it was lasting. The difference between the impact on the land that Californians' earliest inhabitants had and the impact that folks today have on the land is that, in general, the native Californian nations tended to relate to the land in ways that had a positive impact on the world around them, while modern inhabitants, in general, tend to make things worse. Now, this isn't always the case. Some of the more recent immigrants to California and their descendants have done and are doing some really great work around conservation and sustainable living, and the native people probably hunted giant sloths and other macrofauna into extinction. But it's also true that more recent Californians introduced things like automobiles and coal-burning factories. Meanwhile, There were fewer wildfires before Europeans showed up because native people did a better job of forest management than those of us who have arrived more recently and cut down too many old trees and put out naturally occurring fires that might have allowed the forest to recover after our logging. And so, because humans, all humans, have an impact on the world, and indeed we can only survive by changing our landscapes, as people of faith, I think we need to ask, will our impact be positive or negative? We have come into possession of a place that has not been pristine for thousands and thousands of years. What will we do with it? That is a question we need to answer locally and globally. Locally, we as a church need to be asking how we can be better stewards of the small piece of Temescal Creek watershed that belongs to us. And as individuals, we need to ask, what kind of impact will we have on the pieces of land that our houses are on? And how are we going to treat the air that we share with others and the water that we must conserve as California slips into yet another drought? Globally, as a congregation, we need to be thinking about our carbon footprint, and we need to support one another in efforts to address climate change, both with our personal choices and with our activism. And as a bit of a commercial, let me say that the call to action on climate change that some folks from our congregation are presenting to us at a congregational meeting this weekend, well, I think it's a really good starting place for us in this regard. I realize that some people watching this video will be watching it after our congregation approves the climate call to action, but if you are watching this video before 11 a.m. on Sunday, I hope you will join us as we make this important statement together. One of the things that I've learned, fairly recently actually, is that I've learned how much the teachings of Jesus are about ethics, about how we treat one another. They're about ethics more than they are about theology and spirituality. And as I was wandering around last Sunday, taking pictures of flowers, it struck me that because humans live lives that have an impact on the earth, that means that we live lives that necessarily impact one another, because we share the earth. The food that we eat, well, it has to be grown and harvested and packaged and sold by someone. The need for things like transportation and housing necessarily mean that we have to limit where some of our neighbors can live and walk safely. The felt need to dwell in desirable neighborhoods with excellent schools and great services means that those with the means to do so will displace those who cannot afford to live in wonderful places. And it's not just the living. We also live lives that impact generations yet unborn, because everyone both inherits the earth and bequeaths the earth. And when I think about the ethics of Jesus, it's all about treating one another well, loving your neighbor, forgiving, having compassion, making peace, working for justice. When we think about and make decisions about how our lives will affect the landscape around us and even to the